So BFO, which is what this book is about, is an attempt to create you haven't seen that? No. It's an attempt, here is a handout about the book. Create a resource which can be used by the many, many people working in computer science who are building ontologies. And unfortunately, to a large degree, they're all doing it in different ways. And the book is about how to do it in what I think of as the correct way, which is to a large degree motivated by philosophical thinking about ontology. And the reason why computer scientists and people working in database engineering and so forth are building ontologies is because they're trying to find ways of classifying data so that they can share data between different organizations or different scientific communities or what one will. And basic formal ontology, and this is the only reference to Edmund Husserl in this talk, is named after a passage in the second edition of Husserl's Logical Investigations in which the term formal ontology was first used. And so this is the book. The basic formal ontology is now used by 200 different ontology development groups, and I have a list here if anybody wants to see the list. Most of them are still in biomedicine, but more and more BFO is being used by organizations in other areas, and it's just been submitted to the International Standards Organization to if everything goes well, become the ISO standard top-level ontology. So keep your fingers crossed. So it's used, as I say, by many biologist groups, including the OBO Foundry, which is a group of ontology developers in the realm of genomics, cell biology, and proteomics, and so forth. And then various other biology groups illustrated here. It's used by the Federal Highway Administration, by the United Nations, by the United States Geological Survey, and then by various other organizations. Now, BFO rests on 4 dichotomies, and some of them we've heard already. So continuant, recurrent, dependent, independent. The important one is realizable versus non-realizable. It will become clear what that means in due course. So this is the very top of BFO. Everything in reality, or everything in reality which we've represented so far in BFO, there may be other kinds of things. So BFO does not claim to be complete. Is divided into 2 subcategories of continuance and occurrence. And continuants are divided further into 2 subcategories of independent continuants, which are roughly speaking physical things, and dependent continuants, which are roughly speaking attributes. And one important category of independent continuants is material entities, and then one important subcategory of material entities, which will play a role in what follows, is the category of object. Organisms are objects. Collectives are aggregates of objects. They're not objects in their own right. And then a cat's tail, or my arm, or the leg of, well, no, keep the table to one side. The top half of the top of this table would be a fiat object part. Now, BFO is used as follows. There are various ontology editors, which you can think of as ontology word processors. They enable you to build ontologies. And if you want to build a cell ontology, you import BFO, which is what you can see at the very top here, and then you go down BFO until you find the word which you need to do the cell ontology. All cells are objects, and so you take BFO object, and then you define a cell as a special kind of object. And then you define kinds of cells by following what you know about cells from your cell biology. And in this way, you build the ontology of cells. And that idea has been used now at least 200 times by people building ontologies of different domains. Now, qualities are things like temperature, or height, or mass. And every quality specifically depends on some bearer, which is the entity which has that quality. And processes specifically depend on their participants. So if I kick Kevin, and there are two participants, me and him, and then there is the process of kicking. And none of this is rocket science. Then there are instances. So Kevin is an instance of the BFO kind object, and Kevin's mass is an instance of the BFO kind quality, and the kicking is an instance of the kind process. And these are the instances. You can see them illustrated along the bottom there. And then we have realization. Now, one subkind of specifically dependent continuum we've already seen, that's quality, but there's another subkind which is disposition, and the disposition is realized in a process of realization. So the glass has the disposition to shatter, and the process of shattering is a realization of the disposition, or tendency, or potentiality of the glass to shatter. This is the only modal logic in BFO. So we put all modal stuff under the heading of disposition, which of course is where it should go. So there are non-realizable dependent continuants and there are realizable dependent continuants. And we'll be very interested in the realizable dependent continuants because that's where the deontic realm is most likely to lie. There are three kinds of realizable dependent continuants recognized by BFO. Roles, which are ascribed to entities. They're what Searle would call deontic status, that kind of thing. Dispositions we talked about, and then functions, which for BFO are special kinds of dispositions. And we won't talk about functions in what follows. We're going to be interested in dispositions primarily, which depend upon the physics of their bearers. So if an entity has a disposition, then that's because of the way it's built. And that means that if a disposition begins to exist, there has to be some physical change in the bearer. And from this it follows that obligations can't be dispositions, because you can acquire obligations without changing physically.
So the basic rule is obviously false.
Go on.
Suppose an entity comes into being.
Yep.
Okay. So at the moment that it comes into being, a disposition begins to exist. But there wasn't any.
Which disposition?
But there wasn't any physical change in the bearer.
Which disposition came into existence? Give me a real example.
Well, I don't know. Suppose that a butterfly comes into existence.
But the butterfly is just the larva. It's a phase in
the bearer of the disposition is the butterfly.
But the butterfly and the larva are identical. They're identical.
The butterfly has certain dispositions, mainly to fly. Okay.
So
which
the
larva didn't have. So the basic group is false. So
no, it's not. It's just a phase change. I'm not convinced, but we can come back to that. So let's start doing the ontology of deontic entities. We're already up to slide 54, but there are 300 numbers here. There are only 68 slides. I deleted some slides, or hid them. All right, another basic rule is that everything in the ontology has to have instances in reality. So we don't have categories in BFO unless there are instances which fall under those categories. And this is a rule which we try to impose upon all the ontologies which are based on BFO. So these are scientifically realist ontologies. They're motivated by the idea that only those categories exist which have instances. And there were philosophers who held similar views, I understand. All right, so we're not going to talk about information entities today, but information entities are things like PDF files or documents or emails or images in a computer, and they have or are instances in reality because there are, for instance, screens on which pixels appear and so forth. All right, now, we human beings, like the organisms in this room, have various dispositions. We have dispositions to make decisions, we have dispositions to care for our children, we have dispositions to make promises and so forth. And we have those dispositions because of the way we are made, originally as a result of our development, our fetal and embryonic development, and then also as a result of socialization, including language learning, which is the most important kind of socialization for what follows. So we are shaped by our environment and by our genetics. And then the question is, do we have obligations corresponding to these dispositions? Do we have obligations to care for our children, for instance? Now, as it happens, I think that we do. But I'm not going to talk about those obligations. I'm going to talk about the obligations which arise, for instance, when somebody is appointed to an office or to a role in an organization. I'm not going to talk about Hillary Clinton, but this is the organigram of the US Department of State. When somebody is appointed to a position in such an organization, then they acquire a series of dispositions which will be documented in paperwork that they sign. And they will have a series of authorities over the people that they manage and so forth, which will be people who in turn have signed similar documents. And they will have obligations to follow the instructions of you as you sign the document to become the occupant of that particular role. So I'm interested in obligations like that. I want to understand the ontology of the organigram ontology. But that's very difficult, and we don't have time. So we're just going to make do with this simple example. I'm interested in these kinds of obligations, which is what we've been talking about all day long. So we have an obligation and a claim, and they are mutually dependent continuants. So they fit under BFO, at least to that degree. Claims and obligations are mutually dependent continuants. But they are not dispositions, and they're not functions, and they're not roles. And they are the only three kinds of realizable dependent continuants that we have. And claims and obligations clearly are realizables. You realize an obligation by doing X in this particular case. It may be doing Y, but here it's doing X. And the claim gets realized when the obligation is realized.
So, do you want to be interrupted or not?
No, but you're going to anyway. All right, so where did claims and obligations go? And I don't know yet. I think I'm making progress, but they're not going to be easy to deal with. But I think we have a lot of the machinery that we need here. So start with roles. When John makes the promise, then he becomes obliged to Mary. He acquires the obligor role. And Mary acquires the obligee role. These are real words, Kevin. And these two roles are mutually dependent upon each other, so there cannot be somebody who has the obligor role unless there is somebody who has the obligee role. There may be collective obligors and obligees. Kevin's bank, for instance, Kevin's lawyers, the police in Kevin's village, may all be, anyway, I won't go into it. So, roles are externally grounded realizables. They don't depend on the physics of the role possessor. They depend on the way the role possessor is treated by other people. So a stone which has the property marker role, for instance, has that role not because of the physics of the stone, but because of the way in which the stone is treated by lawyers and surveyors. Now, for this reason, roles have no physical pull. They don't have any they don't correspond to any physical properties of the entities which have them. And Searle talks a lot about this. But it seems they also have no deontic pull either. Or anyway, all by themselves, they have no deontic pull. We need to say a lot more about the entities which have roles if we're going to explain how roles configure in entities having things like claims, obligations. So let's go and look at dispositions. When, as Reinach says, John makes a promise to Mary, then he acquires a disposition to fulfill the content of that promise. And what Reinach doesn't go into is that Mary also typically, usually, often, acquires a disposition to monitor John to check whether he has performed the content of the promise. And if he fails to perform, then she will have a disposition to claim in the active sense, namely she will complain, she will sue, she will do one or other of the things which you do if people do not fulfill the contents of their promises. So we have these four elements which we need to work with in order to provide an account of what obligation is, in the simple sense of the obligation of the promisor in relation to the claim of the promisee. So we can say somewhat more, and actually most of what we say is on the Mary side, because it's clear that even though when John makes a promise to Mary, he acquires a, Reinach says, he acquires a disposition or tendency to fulfill the promise, within seconds he may abandon that tendency. He's still obliged. There has to be an initial tendency, Reinach says, but it can disappear within seconds. That we know that this happens when men make promises to women. But Mary has typically, normally, usually, in many cases, across societies made up of organisms like you and me, Mary still has the disposition to monitor and to evoke a claim and to blame John and to shame John and maybe even to punish John or sue John, at least to complain about John, usually, if he doesn't perform on his claim. So Mary's dispositions will have a history. They will have a typical evolution. First of all, she will check whether he's actually performing, but then when it's clear that he's not performing and when the time comes, she will start blaming and shaming. But of course, Mary may be uninterested. So the one question would be, if Mary loses interest in John, does that mean that she de facto renounces her claim? It may be that she really needs John to do X. John has gone away somewhere. She can't punish John because she's become physically incapacitated, but she really needs X to be done by John. It would seem that John still has an obligation and Mary still has a claim, but Mary has no disposition to do any of those things. So the obligation cannot be exhausted by what is depicted here. Not even from the dispositional point of view, I will argue. All right, so BFO means basic formal ontology, and these are the relevant formal parts of BFO. And the stuff at the bottom, so that's formale ontologie, the stuff at the bottom is domain-specific ontology. It's about things like monitoring claims, which are not formal, they are material, they belong to the domain of social acts. And we are building a social act ontology. So this is BFO2. I have another handout here for what it's worth. We don't need really very much of this at all, but this is all of BFO. BFO is designed to be a small ontology. The gene ontology has something like 40,000 terms, which is somewhat bigger than this. And there are ontologies with 100,000 terms. We're interested just in this corner here, just for illustrative purposes. So we already saw this axis from material entity down to object. Collectives, as I already said, are object aggregates. And now populations and communities, population of mice, the community or population of the Magyars, there is an ontology of populations and communities called the Ontology of Populations and Communities, which deals with things like the population of mice or the community of Hungarians. But that's material ontology. Now, just as there are object aggregates in BFO, so also we could have a term in Buffo, which is the term aggregate of dispositions. We don't have that term yet, but we may add it. Depends whether it's useful. And what I want to argue is that to understand obligations, we're going to need the term aggregate of dispositions. And that's because of the reasons I just mentioned. John can be obliged, even if Mary doesn't care, because she's unconscious, for instance. John can be obliged because the corresponding dispositions exist in the wider society. That's the idea. Obligations, like the obligations of John, are rooted, in other words, in aggregates of dispositions spread across larger societies. Now, it could be that John doesn't care about the fact that he has made the promise, and Mary is unconscious, and no one else knows. So there is no disposition on the part of the wider society. But there is a disposition on the part of the wider society to punish people like John, who make promises like the promise that John made, in circumstances like the circumstance that the two of them are now in. And so even though in any given specific case, the obligation may lack a rootedness in an aggregate of dispositions in the wider society, the practice of acquiring obligations through promising would still exist, and that would still be the way to understand the ontology of obligations like the obligation that John created for himself by making a promise to Mary. Now, to see how all of this works, we need, and this is a kind of Searlean journey that we're going to follow. So I think languages are aggregates of dispositions. So a language is made up of competencies. It's competent, and I think this is actually the correct view. So this is not something I'm presenting in order to soften up your intuitions about obligations. I think this is the correct account of language. One problem with the account is that it looks as if it might be circular. But in favor of the account is that I can't think of anything better. And it seems to give the right account of things like dialects. So if we look at this picture, which is a picture of, it's a classification of Romance languages. So it's a kind of ontology. And the environing circle here, which leaves out island Romance languages, namely Old Corsican and Sardinian. The wider circle is the collection of dialects called Continental Romance. All of those dialects share in common a common subset of dispositions. They differ in many detailed ways, but they share many dispositions, and that's why they're all called Romance languages. And similarly, each of the subgroups share a slightly larger number of dispositions, and then the very small subgroups share many more dispositions, which is why people who speak Neapolitan can understand each other more easily than can people who speak Neapolitan understand people who speak Friulian. All right. So, a language is an aggregate of dispositions. The French language is an aggregate of dispositions which, like all other languages, is supported by various mechanisms. For mothers, for instance, are the most important mechanism, because they propagate the language to the next generation. But schools play a role, and in France they have this special thing called l'Académie Française, which is charged with fixing the usage of French, if you're lucky. Now, prices are like language, so the price system, this is why I wanted you to talk about price tags earlier. The price system is a set of dispositions which is also supported by certain mechanisms like markets and the Wall Street Journal and so forth. and notices on Paris bars, and exchange offices where you can change euros for money. And then laws, the legal system, like the law of England, which is once more free. Or soon will be anyway. The legal system of England is an aggregate of dispositions which is similarly maintained by a system called the English legal system, which includes things like lawmakers, courts, police actions, and so forth. And now Thomas Reid has a theory of social operations which says, you're all familiar with Thomas Reid's anticipation of Reinach, I assume. A social act, when you direct it to some other person, constitutes a miniature civil society. So when John promises to Mary that he will do X, then they create a miniature civil society, which is the kind of thing which will have an aggregate of dispositions, like a language or a price system or a religion, or what was the other example I had? Never mind. So, and then we have Reinach. And then we have Austin. And I missed out. Anyway. So, when I say I promise, I have not merely announced by my intention, but bound myself to others and staked my reputation. And someone who guarantees and turns out to be wrong is liable to be rounded on by others. So that's the core thesis. Someone who makes a promise is liable to be rounded on by others. The liable means the disposition. The others means it's an aggregate of dispositions. And the rounded means it's a disposition to punish.
Explain the word round.
Rounded means hit with sticks. I don't know, when you play rounders. Punished. Ganged up against. Bullied. Shamed. People will raise their eyebrows. Bad things like that. So, this is the thesis. John's obligation is grounded in the disposition on the part of either Mary or of the wider society to punish John or people in similar circumstances to John if they fail to do X. Now, when he's talking about these things, Austin recommends 3 source books: the dictionary, the law, and psychology. So, the dictionary tells us that the dispositions of the sort that we're interested in, the dispositions like the dispositions to round upon people when they fail to keep their word, these dispositions are very similar to the dispositions that we learn when we acquire a language. So when the mother teaches her children to speak, she also teaches her children to monitor people who do the promising kind of speaking. So she teaches, so to learn, and Searle gets this right, and that is not something that is astonishing, but he does get this right. When you learn how to use the word promise, you learn how to monitor and shame and perform on your promises. You learn how to create the miniature civil society which promising brings about. And in the course of doing all of that, you learn also how to blame, shame, and so forth. So, as we learn language, we first of all learn what we can think of as intralinguistic dispositions. We learn how to speak to each other, how to pay attention, how to register what the other person said, and so on, how to respond appropriately, and we learn how to monitor and blame. And we learn how to use language to achieve extra-linguistic benefits. We learn how to request, to beg, to guarantee, to contract, and so forth. And these take us beyond language. We might say that they are ways of doing things with words. And then there are extra-linguistic realizables, which are which come into existence through uses of language. And so the promising triggers the coming to existence of a disposition to fulfill the promise on the side of the promisor, a disposition to monitor the fulfillment on the side of the promisee, and similarly in the case of waiving a claim, which triggers the ceasing to exist of those realizables. So remember, realizables are real entities. They have instances in reality. Now, mere speaking creates dispositions because language is a set of dispositions, an aggregate of dispositions inhering in a miniature civil society called a linguistic community. And this will not be the linguistic community called continental romance. It will be the linguistic community called the community of people speaking languages which know the promising speech act pattern, something like that. That whole society bears dispositions to monitor and blame those who don't keep their promises. But also, they bear disposition to expect such blaming and shaming from others. And they also bear dispositions to expect that others will expect that they will blame and shame, and so on. Without limit, which is hard to fit into a brain. We seem to manage. All right, now, as I said, dispositions are internally grounded. That means that to get these dispositions, you have to be physically changed. So how is John physically changed? By making a promise to Mary. And I've nearly done. I'm up to slide 125. So, as we saw at the beginning, we have all of these general dispositions, all of us, all human beings, to make friends, to make promises, and so on. This is because of the way we are shaped biologically and the way we are socialized, for instance, by learning language. But now, and if anyone knows the literature on dispositions, then they can perhaps help me find out who said this already. Those dispositions, those general dispositions to make friends, to search for enemies, to hunt down our enemies, to round on people who break their promises, become indexicalized to specific dispositions relating to specific targets. So the general disposition to seek a mate, when you find Mary, becomes locked onto a specific target, namely Mary, and it's converted into specific dispositions, which are being nice to Mary dispositions. Now, does anyone know any treatment of that in the literature of dispositions?
It's very often called not indexicalization, but specification.
Okay, and who talks about it?
There are, what do they call, higher order dispositions, which get specified.
And have you seen any people who talk about specification onto one target? Because I checked and I talked to dispositions authors and they don't know it. So an example would be... Oh, that's true, yes, I can ask him. But another example would be the detective is looking for the killer. And finally, he thinks he's found the killer, and so all his activities are now locked on finding evidence to prosecute this killer. All right, now, so John is now loaded with a specific set of being nice to Mary dispositions, and John sees that Mary needs him to do X. And this triggers a realization of his general promise-making disposition, which he has because of his mother teaching him about promising, in the form of, and which is realized in the specific, I promise to do X speech act process, which is directed towards Mary. Now, this speech act has an intention to do X on behalf of Mary as one component. All of this is familiar, I'm sure. Now, when an organism forms this intention to do X, this terms, this is verschmolzen mit, it's intrinsically fused with the beginning to exist of a disposition to do X. What that means is that there is a physical change in the bearer. When you form an intention, your brain changes. Now, we know in the case of John, it may only change for a few seconds. But still, there is a physical change, and it's in virtue of that that the disposition can come into existence. And that's why Reinhardt saw that the acid promise gives rise to the tendency to realize the content of the promise. If it didn't, there would have been no intention and no disposition, because there would have been nothing, no physical change. All right. Now, that means that you sign your employment contract, which says that as of midnight next week, you will become the Undersecretary for Potato Export in the Department of State. Now, already when you sign the document, there is a physical change which manifests itself as expectation, which is a disposition about what will happen on Monday when you become the Undersecretary of State. And that's it. That was quick.